4:47 a.m. East 93rd Street, Cleveland, Ohio. A six-person entry team stacked at the side door of a two-story row house in the Kinsman corridor. 12 degrees Fahrenheit. Snow packed hard against the porch steps. One agent carried a 40-pound battering ram. Two more had flashbang canisters clipped to their vests. The team leader raised his hand. 3 fingers. 2. 1. The door came off its hinges on the first swing. 11 adult women, ages 22 to 26, reported missing from homes across northern Ohio, were recovered from inside that house. All 11 had been confined in a boarded-off rear addition, accessed through what looked from the street like a broken utility panel. The panel was actually a hinged sheet of painted plywood mounted flush behind a real electrical meter. To anyone passing on the street at any hour, it was invisible. 28 firearms came out of the same house. Rifles. Pistols. 1 belt-fed conversion. 10 suspected members of a Kinsman corridor street network were taken into federal custody before sunrise. The FBI's Cleveland field office would later describe the East 93rd Street address as a single location in a structure that had operated for months without complaint. No noise violations on file. No calls to the city's non-emergency line. No utility disputes. What cracked it was not a wire. Not an informant's tip. Not a federal intercept. It was the smell of kerosene exhaust drifting from a house where the gas had been shut off for 11 months. The patrol officer who noticed it was working a graveyard shift in early December of 2025. His name, for purposes of this account, is Officer Reyes. He was 6 months out of the academy. He was not looking for anything unusual that Sunday morning. He was 3 hours into a shift, driving a standard sector loop through the Kinsman corridor, when the smell hit him through the car's ventilation system, near the intersection of East 93rd and Outhwaite Avenue. Kerosene heaters have a specific signature. Not wood smoke, not vehicle exhaust, not the standard coal dust and rust smell the corridor carries in winter. Reyes had grown up in a house that used kerosene heat through the 90s. He knew it immediately. He pulled over. The house at the address he logged, for purposes of this reconstruction, that address is referred to throughout as the 93rd Street property, was dark. Every window was covered. No light through any gap in any pane. No sound from the sidewalk. A for sale sign from a property management company had been planted in the frozen front yard sometime in late autumn. Reyes ran the address through the city utility database on his mobile terminal. What came back took him a moment to process. Gas service to the 93rd Street property had been disconnected on January 8th of 2025. 11 months earlier. The account holder was listed as a limited liability company registered in Delaware, a name with no web presence, no street address, and no phone number. Heat source in a house with no gas line. Covered windows. The middle of the night. No complaints, no violations, no history. Reyes flagged it in his end-of-shift debrief report at 7:12 a.m. The report went to a patrol sergeant who forwarded it to a detective with the Cleveland Police Department's Property Crimes Unit. That detective, referred to here as Detective Calloway, had been running surveillance on an unrelated narcotics complaint 2 blocks south. Calloway read the debrief note on his lunch break. The utility company reference caught him. He had seen that LLC name before. The company that had held the gas account on the 93rd Street property also appeared in a city housing database in an unexpected context. 3 other vacant properties on the same block, all listed as pending rehabilitation under a city blight remediation program, were held by the same Delaware LLC or by a second company registered to the same agent. 4 properties. 1 block. Same registered agent. No renovation activity on any of them. No rental history, no permits pulled, no inspections scheduled or completed. That was the paperwork thread. And it stayed in the paperwork, where it belongs in any investigation. What it told Calloway was straightforward. Somebody was maintaining a real estate footprint on this block for reasons that had nothing to do with real estate. He made a call to the FBI's Cleveland field office. The field office assigned the lead to a case agent on the Violent Crimes Task Force, referred to throughout this account as Special Agent Navarro. Navarro pulled the 93rd Street property's full utility and tax history. Gas shut off in January. Electric service still active under a second LLC. Water account current under the same second LLC. No city tax delinquency. Somebody was paying the bills, just not the ones you needed for heat. Except there was heat. The gap between those two facts, an active heat source and no legal fuel supply, meant somebody was running kerosene heaters inside a property with blacked-out windows at 2 or 3 in the morning in a house the city tax records still considered unoccupied. Navarro presented a preliminary outline to a supervising assistant United States attorney on December 19th of 2025. The outline was enough for a surveillance authorization. The task force began stationary observation on the 93rd Street property the following morning. What came out of the next 40 days of surveillance would reshape the operation 3 separate times. The first week produced vehicle traffic. A dark gray Chevrolet Tahoe appeared at the property between 10 p.m. and 4 a.m. on 5 of 7 nights. License plate readers placed the same vehicle at 2 other Kinsman corridor addresses during the same window. Both were flagged in existing CPD files as known meeting points for a crew operating in the corridor, a crew investigators had been watching since October. The second week produced a person. Surveillance footage from a Ring camera across the street, footage the camera's owner had no idea was relevant, showed a man in a black parka entering the side door of the property on the evening of December 28th. That man, referred to here as Suspect Drummond, had told a federal cooperating witness 2 weeks earlier that he had never set foot on East 93rd Street. Wrong Ring camera timestamp. Right face. Navarro flagged the footage to the task force. The timestamp on the camera's file metadata put Drummond at the address at 7:43 p.m. on the 28th. The camera's internal clock was running 14 minutes fast, a discrepancy confirmed by cross-referencing against a city traffic camera at the intersection, which placed Drummond's vehicle arriving at 7:29 p.m. The correction locked the identification. The defense of mistaken identity, Drummond's only argument given his stated denial, collapsed. By the end of the first week of January 2026, the task force had linked the 93rd Street property to 6 identified individuals, 3 vehicles, and the Delaware LLC structure. The narcotics angle that had originally prompted CPD's attention was still present. 2 controlled buys conducted by a confidential informant at a secondary address had produced enough for a standalone drug warrant. But Navarro had begun to suspect the 93rd Street property was not primarily a narcotics operation. The deliveries were wrong. Narcotics operations generate a specific vehicle pattern, short duration stops, high frequency, irregular hours but small windows. What the task force was seeing at the 93rd Street property was different. Occasional long duration stops. The same vehicles returning days apart rather than hours apart. And on 3 separate surveillance nights, thermal imaging equipment positioned from a utility vehicle 2 blocks north had detected multiple stationary heat signatures in the rear section of the building. Not moving. Not trafficking product in and out. Stationary. Something was being held in the rear of that house. Navarro requested a second authorization, this one for extended thermal imaging, and a court-authorized intercept on one of the 6 identified phones. The authorization was granted on January 15th. What came back over the following 18 days would become the core of the federal criminal complaint ultimately filed in the Northern District of Ohio. The phone intercept produced a series of conversations referencing account. Not account of product. Account of people. Numbers referenced in conversation, still the same, 1 less, back to where it was, were consistent, in the task force's interpretation, with the management of individuals rather than inventory. None of the conversations were explicit. All of them were short. The speakers demonstrated consistent operational caution. The thermal imaging produced something more definitive. On 7 of the 18 nights of extended observation, the rear section of the 93rd Street property showed between 8 and 13 stationary heat signatures, consistent in shape and distribution with human bodies in a confined space. The signatures appeared at night and persisted for hours. They were not consistent with stored product, animal activity, or equipment. Navarro brought the combined package to the supervising assistant United States Attorney on February 2nd of 2026. The meeting lasted 40 minutes. The attorney asked 2 questions: whether the thermal imaging had been conducted under a valid warrant, and whether the Ring camera footage had been legally obtained. Both answers were yes. The attorney authorized the task force to proceed toward a rescue warrant. Here is the part that took the most time, and it is the part that gets left out of most accounts of operations like this one: the preparation between authorization and entry. The task force did not know how many people were inside the rear section of the 93rd Street property. The thermal imaging gave a range, 8 to 13, but thermal imaging through 2 sets of walls at a 2-block distance is not precise. They did not know the physical layout of the rear addition. The city's building inspection records predated a structural modification that appeared in aerial imagery from 2023. The floor plan on file was at minimum 3 years out of date. They did not know whether the people inside were mobile or incapacitated. They did not know the nature of any restraints. They did not know whether any occupants of the house were armed. 20 minutes before the planned entry, a final intelligence update came in. A patrol unit that had been running a loose outer perimeter since 3:15 a.m. reported that the gray Tahoe was parked at the rear of the property, a position it had not occupied on any previous surveillance night. The Tahoe's presence at the rear meant at least one of the identified crew members was inside. The entry team adjusted. The original plan had called for simultaneous front and side entry. With the Tahoe at the rear, and the probability of an armed individual between the main structure and the rear addition, the team shifted to a 3-point breach: side door primary, rear door simultaneous, front door 30 seconds delayed as a containment measure rather than an entry point. You could argue the adjustment was excessive caution. You could also argue it was what kept the operation from becoming something far worse. At 4:47 a.m. on February 17th of 2026, a Tuesday, the side door came off its hinges on the first ram swing. Flashbangs on the front porch. The stack of 4 moving through the side entryway. At the rear of the structure, a second 2-person team hit the back door simultaneously. The main floor was cleared in under 90 seconds. 6 individuals were encountered in the main structure. All 6 were taken to the ground without shots fired. All 6 were cuffed and moved to the sidewalk, where they lay face down under the strobing red and blue of a perimeter of CPD cruisers. The 7th, 8th, and 9th individuals were found in an interior room on the 2nd floor. The 9th attempted to exit through a 2nd floor window and was stopped by a perimeter officer positioned on the side street. The 10th was located behind the structure near the Tahoe. He ran. He made it approximately 30 feet before 2 task force agents on the rear perimeter brought him down. 10 in custody. Side door breached. Main structure cleared. Now came the panel. The false utility panel was on the interior rear wall of the main structure, the wall that separated the main building from the boarded-off rear addition. From inside the house, it looked like a standard gray electrical panel cover, the kind found in every residential building in the city, mounted at chest height with a real breaker box installed directly behind and slightly above it. The hinges were on the left side and not visible from the front. The latch mechanism was a standard interior cabinet hook and eye, painted gray to match the panel cover. Without knowing it was there, you would have needed to find the edge gap, less than a 1/4 inch, to identify it as a door at all. Agent Navarro found it because of where the heat signatures had appeared in the thermal imaging. Not in the main structure. In the wall behind the panel. He put a gloved hand along the right edge of the panel cover. Found the gap. Found the latch by feel. Disengaged it. The panel swung open on its hinges. Warm air came out first, the unmistakable close warmth of a space that had been inhabited for a long time. Then light. A kerosene lamp on a wooden shelf, burning low. Then the room itself, a space approximately 12 feet by 20 feet, built into what had been an exterior rear addition, with 2 ceiling joists exposed, a concrete floor, 2 windows completely covered with layered cardboard and silver duct tape, and 8 metal cots arranged along the walls. On the cots, and on the floor between them, 11 young women. All 11 were conscious. All 11 were adults. The youngest, based on identification later confirmed, was 22 years old. The oldest was 26. All 11 had been reported missing from addresses in Cuyahoga, Summit, and Lorain counties. The earliest disappearance report dated to November 14th of 2025, 65 days before the raid. All 11 were transported directly to University Hospital's Cleveland Medical Center. The task force case agent made the first call to a family at 5:22 a.m. That call lasted 4 minutes. The second call came 3 minutes later. By 6:15 a.m., 11 families had been notified. What agents did not do, and were trained not to do, was describe the condition of the women to the families over the phone. A hospital intake coordinator would handle that. What agents said was, "She is alive, she is receiving care, someone will meet you at the hospital." That was enough. For 11 families who had spent between 22 and 65 days without that sentence, it was enough. The weapons came out of the main structure in a separate operation, cataloged by an evidence team that arrived at 5:10 a.m. 28 firearms total. 14 pistols, including 4 that had been reported stolen in Cuyahoga County in the prior 2 years. 11 rifles, a mix of semi-automatic configurations. 2 shotguns. 1 belt-fed conversion device installed on a modified rifle receiver, a federal firearms felony independent of any other charge. The firearms were not stored in a single location. 4 were found in the front room. 9 were in a second-floor bedroom in a duffel bag under a bed. The belt-fed conversion was in a locked metal cabinet in a kitchen closet. The remaining 14 were in a locked rear storage room in the main structure, separate from the addition where the 11 women had been held. The volume of weapons relative to the size of the crew, 10 individuals, 28 firearms, told a specific story. This was not personal carry. This was a depot. Here is what this case shows about how these operations survive. The footprint is engineered for invisibility. A residential property in a high vacancy corridor. A legal LLC structure that handles the utility accounts, so no individual name appears on a bill. Covered windows that any passerby attributes to abandonment. No activity during daylight hours. No vehicle traffic that deviates from what the block already looks like at 2 in the morning. Every element was designed to look like nothing. What broke it was not a federal database or a wiretap or an informant's decision to cooperate. It was a patrol officer who grew up in a house that smelled like kerosene, driving a sector loop on a Sunday morning, who knew that a cold house should not smell warm. An honest read of the evidence suggests that without that one sensory detail, reported in a routine debrief note, the 93rd Street property could have operated for another 6 months without triggering a single formal inquiry. The LLC structure was legitimate enough to pass routine review. The utility accounts were current. There were no complaints. There was no noise. The network had built its shelter to be invisible, and it nearly was. Something about that reality sits uneasily, even in a case that ended with 11 women alive and 10 suspects in custody. The mechanism worked. The investigation worked. The rescue worked. And it rested on a 6-month rookie's memory of what his childhood home smelled like on a winter morning. By February 21st, 4 days after the raid, federal prosecutors in the Northern District of Ohio had filed a criminal complaint charging all 10 arrested individuals with offenses including unlawful detention, conspiracy, and federal firearms violations. A grand jury was convened to consider further charges. Suspect Drummond, the individual whose face appeared on the neighbor's Ring camera, the one who had told a federal cooperating witness he had never been to East 93rd Street, was identified in the complaint as a principal organizer of the operation at the 93rd Street property. His attorney declined to enter a plea at the initial appearance. Bond was denied. Of the remaining 9, 7 were held without bond at the Cuyahoga County Correctional Center, pending arraignment. 2 were transferred to federal custody at a separate facility, consistent with the task force's assessment that those 2 individuals had connections to activity outside of Cuyahoga County. The sentencing exposure on the firearms charges, specifically the belt-fed conversion device, may ultimately run longer than the exposure on the unlawful detention counts. A belt-fed conversion on a modified receiver carries a mandatory federal minimum that the detention charges, absent certain aggravating specifications, do not. Whether that outcome reflects appropriate proportionality in federal sentencing law is a question the prosecutors in this case were not asked to resolve. They applied the statutes they had. But it is a question worth asking. The Shell LLC structure, the Delaware registration, the property holdings, the utility account layering, was referred to the IRS Criminal Investigation Division and the Treasury Department's Financial Crimes Enforcement Network for parallel review. Federal investigators identified at least 2 additional addresses in Cleveland and 1 in Akron, linked through the same LLC network. Neither of the Cleveland addresses produced evidence of current illegal activity at the time of their search, though both contained materials consistent with prior use. The Akron address was more complicated. It had been vacated. Equipment was found inside, consistent with a habitation, cots, a portable heater, covered windows. No people. No contraband. No weapons. The task force assessment was that the Akron address had been used, cleared, and abandoned in the period immediately preceding the East 93rd Street raid. Whether that clearance was a coincidence of timing or evidence of advance warning was, as of the filing of the initial complaint, unresolved. 3 of the 10 individuals arrested at the 93rd Street property remain unnamed in the public charging documents, their identities protected under seal pending further proceedings. Federal investigators declined to characterize whether any of the 3 were cooperating with the government or whether their anonymity reflected ongoing operational security. Investigators also declined to state how the network had acquired the 11 women held in the rear addition. The complaint described the detention as unlawful and prolonged. It described the conditions of the rear addition. It did not describe how the 11 women came to be there, over what period they had been brought in, or whether any individuals connected to that process had been identified. One of the 11 had been reported missing from an address in Lorain County 65 days before the raid. Her family had filed reports with the Lorain County Sheriff's Office, the Ohio Bureau of Criminal Investigation, and the National Center for Missing and Exploited Adults. She had appeared on no law enforcement bulletin in the Cuyahoga County system. The county-to-county information gap, a documented structural problem in Ohio's missing persons reporting infrastructure, had effectively removed her from the investigative picture entirely. She would not have been found through the reporting system. She was found because a rookie patrol officer smelled kerosene. Put yourself in the position of that officer for a moment, sitting in a patrol car at 2 in the morning, running a sector loop in a corridor you've been driving for 6 months, and deciding whether a smell is worth the paperwork. Most officers would have logged it as a possible code violation and moved on. Reyes wrote a full flag. He described the smell, the address, the utility query, the LLC name. He wrote it in enough detail that a detective 2 desks away read it and made a phone call. That level of thoroughness, from someone 6 months into their first posting is not standard. It is not something that gets trained into officers. It is either in how someone was taught to see, or it is not. The task force search of the 93rd Street property continued through February 18th, a full day after the initial breach. Forensic evidence teams processed the rear addition separately from the main structure. Fingerprints, biological materials, and physical trace evidence were collected and submitted to the FBI laboratory in Quantico, Virginia. The electrical meter that served as the mounting point for the false utility panel, the actual functional breaker box that sat behind and above the hinged plywood cover, had been wired to service the main structure only. The rear addition ran entirely on the kerosene lamps and one battery-powered LED fixture mounted in the ceiling. No electrical connection. No gas. No running water in the rear addition. A single plastic 5-gallon container, used for water, was found near the door. The panel itself, the hinged plywood piece, was photographed extensively for the federal case file. In the evidence photographs, it looks exactly like what it was designed to look like, a standard gray utility cover, flush with the wall, completely unremarkable. The hinges, once you know where to look, are visible in the shadow line on the left edge. Without that knowledge, they are invisible. The evidence team removed the panel and submitted it as a physical exhibit. The breaker box behind it remained attached to the wall. The space where the panel had been, the opening into the rear addition, was left open for photographic documentation. In those photographs, taken under evidence-grade lighting, the cots are visible. The cardboard-covered windows are visible. The kerosene lamp on its shelf is visible. The warm light that spilled through the opening when Navarro unlatched the panel had already faded by the time the forensic photographs were taken. The room was cold by then. The lamp had been extinguished as part of scene safety protocol. The warmth was gone. What remained was a room 12 feet by 20 feet, concrete floor, 8 metal cots, and 11 missing person files that could now be closed. The federal charging timeline moved quickly after arraignment. By March 3rd of 2026, a grand jury in the Northern District of Ohio returned a sealed indictment on charges that expanded the initial complaint. The expansion added counts related to the weapons cache, specifically the belt-fed conversion device and the 4 stolen pistols, and counts referencing the LLC structure as an instrument of the alleged criminal enterprise. Drummond entered a not guilty plea at his arraignment on March 6th. His co-defendants entered similar pleas at a consolidated hearing on March 10th. All 10 remained in custody. The LLC investigation was, as of the public record available at the time of this account, still active. Federal investigators from the FBI's Financial Crimes Unit and the IRS Criminal Investigation Division had issued subpoenas to the Delaware registered agent who had incorporated both LLCs and to a bank in Columbus, Ohio, that had held accounts for the entities. No additional charges in connection with the LLC investigation had been filed as of the date the information in this reconstruction ends. The 2 Cleveland addresses linked to the LLC network through the task force search had been processed and released. The Akron address, the one that had been cleared and abandoned before the raid, remained under a federal preservation order. What it had been used for, and when it had last been occupied, was listed in court filings as a matter under active investigation. 3 names associated with the broader LLC structure, individuals whose connection to the 2 LLCs predated the Delaware registration of the entity that held the 93rd Street utility account by approximately 14 months, had been identified by investigators but had not been charged. Their relationship to the 10 arrested individuals, and to the operation at the 93rd Street property specifically, had not been publicly described as of the close of this account's research window. One of those 3 names appeared in the financial documents obtained under the IRS subpoena. That name also appeared in documents related to one of the vacant city blight remediation properties on the same block, not as the registered owner or the LLC's registered agent, but as the individual who had signed the initial rehabilitation application. The application had been submitted in October of 2025, approximately 6 weeks before Officer Reyes drove his sector loop past the 93rd Street property on a December Sunday morning. The application had never been acted on. The property it described remained vacant. But the signature on the application created a paper thread that federal investigators were, according to court filings, actively following at the time the public record closed. Whether that thread leads anywhere, whether the 3 individuals connected through the LLC documents are ultimately charged, whether the broader network the 93rd Street property represented has been dismantled or merely disrupted at one address, is not resolved in the evidence available here. The Akron address was cleared before agents arrived. Somebody knew, or guessed, or timed it out. There is a version of this investigation where the Akron address is occupied when agents arrive and the scope of the case doubles. There is another version where the 3 names in the LLC documents lead to a second indictment in a second district. There is a third version where none of that happens, where 10 men go to trial on the charges currently filed, and the organizational structure above them is never reached. Which of those versions is real is a question that will be answered in a federal courthouse in Cleveland, or will not be answered at all. What is not in question is the arithmetic of February 17th. 10 suspects detained, 28 firearms recovered, 11 young women, 22 to 26 years old, missing between 22 and 65 days, removed from a locked room behind a painted plywood panel and transported to a hospital where their families were called at 5 in the morning. Here is the question that stays with this case. The rear addition at the 93rd Street property had been in use for at least 65 days before the raid, the duration established by the earliest missing person report. The thermal imaging that eventually triggered the rescue warrant was only authorized in mid-January of 2026. For the 6 weeks between the earliest disappearance and the thermal authorization, nobody was looking at that address. Nobody had reason to. Were there other missing person reports, from Cuyahoga or Summit or Lorain or somewhere farther out, that were filed, routed correctly, logged in the right system, and still never cross-referenced against the addresses the task force was watching? That question has not been publicly answered by any of the agencies involved. The demand that produced the 93rd Street operation did not originate on East 93rd Street. It did not originate in Kinsman. It did not originate in Cleveland. The supply chain that ran through that boarded-off rear addition had customers, and that part of the investigation, if it exists, is not visible in any public filing. The 11 women reported missing, reported, documented, entered into systems that were designed to find them, were inside that room for weeks before a routine debrief note redirected a patrol sergeant's afternoon reading list. The room has been cleared. The panel has been cataloged as evidence. The cots have been photographed and logged. Whether the 3 names connected through the LLC documents are ever charged is unknown. Whether the individual who signed the blight remediation application in October of 2025 knew what the property next door was being used for is unknown. Whether the network that operated at that address on East 93rd Street has been dismantled or has simply moved, changed addresses, changed shell companies, changed corridors, is unknown. What is known is that at 5:22 a.m. on February 17th of 2026, a case agent made the first phone call to the first family. What is known is that the phone was answered on the second ring. What is known is what was said. She is alive. She is receiving care. Someone will meet you at the hospital. That call was made 11 times. Before sunrise. The room is empty now. The demand that filled it still